Well, the provincial election campaign officially started this morning. You will cast your vote on October 28th. We're quickly learning that education is one of the top issues people care about. Violence in schools and overcrowded and increasingly complex classrooms are of concern for many educators. And so provincial politicians will be promising you ways to improve the education system. Meanwhile, local candidates in municipal campaigns across the province are also focused on education. There are people who say so-called parental rights and keeping sex out of the classroom is their major concern. And some are now running for school board positions. You'll cast your vote on that one November 13th. And so today we'll learn about a group in Regina that is endorsing school board candidates with a focus on so-called parental rights. And we'll learn about how Saskatchewan fits into a broader movement across the country to get anti-trans candidates elected at all levels of government. We'll be opening the phone lines in our second half of the show, so write down this phone number, 1-800-716-2221, or you can email right now, bluesky@cbc.ca. Well, these issues were at the forefront at SARM this spring. Listen to the kinds of questions fielded by Education Minister Jeremy Cockrell at the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities Convention.
Okay, Craig Olerheim, councillor from Frontier, number 19. Lots of good discussion about schools. I hate to pick on you anymore. You've done a pretty good job answering questions, but I got words on my paper here, so I'm just gonna read it out. Our schools
So let me ask you a question. Did your administrator put you up to that? Okay, go ahead.
Probably worried about what I'm going to say. Our schools are the future. The ideology that has infiltrated our schools in the past few years is destroying the next generation. Bodie Bauckham said, "We cannot continue to send our children to Caesar for their education and be surprised when they come back as Romans." Our public schools, despite having some very good teachers, are teaching Marxist ideologies and are confusing the next generation and possibly creating little socialists. As important as it is to have a strong economy to build the future, we must train our children in the way that we want them to go.
You got about 20 seconds, so I'm not sure if you have a question you might want to answer.
I'll get to it. We need to decentralize our schools. Urban areas shouldn't dictate what our precious children are taught. How will you ensure that our kids will get the right education? Will you look to decentralizing these large school divisions that group all of our children under one umbrella and do what is best for our most precious resource? There you go.
Thanks for the question, Craig. And, I would say, it's been talked about before, but the discussion that we're having in education right now, a lot of it comes down to local governance and the importance of local governance. And I know I don't need to tell this room the importance of local voice. And I would just say that school board elections matter quite a bit. They matter quite a bit, as do RM elections or urban municipality elections and certainly the provincial election. And so I would just say that, that's why we have 27 school divisions. That's why Chinook School Division, whatever you may think about your school division, at the end of the day, they know probably what's best for your community, what's better for your community than the folks in Regina or Saskatoon do, right? And I would just say, I think about, if we all think about in the room who our favorite teacher was growing up, we probably didn't know their politics, right? We don't remember that great teacher because they expressed what their politics was in the classroom. They were just a great teacher that helped us along and cared about us when we were young. And to that end, I don't think politics belong in the classroom when it comes to making sure that our kids are learning the curriculum and getting a quality education. But I just come back to parental involvement. And I go back to something that both the Premier and I talked about last fall. The legislation that we brought through, Bill 137, it has protected a parent's rights to be involved in their school community council, be involved in their school division, ask questions about what's happening in schools in their community. But at the end of the day, I think it is the belief of this government that the parent is the most important person in a child's life. And I think, as a relatively new parent myself, I certainly recognize that, and I think we all have a role as parents and grandparents in the room to make sure that we are taking that mantle upon ourselves and being very involved, not just what is allowed under legislation, but being quality parents. And so I know I'm getting into a little more of an esoteric response to your question, but I just go back to local governance matters, local school board elections matter, and it's important for parents to be involved.
Okay, so that message from Education Minister Jeremy Cockrell has resonated with many. If you're in Regina right now, you could see a school board election sign that reads, "Education over indoctrination." Parental rights and keeping sex out of the classroom were a source of protest last fall as students headed back to the classroom, and they're big issues once again in this fall's school board elections. That is particularly the case in Regina, where one politically active group is making a push to endorse certain candidates with a focus on parental rights. The CBC's Jenny Whitfield has been looking into this and joins us right now. Jenny, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hi, Leisha.
So what can you tell us about this group?
So we've been hearing about the Regina Civic Awareness and Action Network, or RCAN, for years now, really. And I've been wanting to sit down with one of the founders and learn more about what this group is and what its goals are. So when I heard this conservative-minded group was working to get some of its members and other endorsed candidates elected to the public school board as trustees, I was keen to sit down and find out why. Wayne Bernikavich is one of the three founders for the group, but he's a retired lawyer in Regina, and he told me he and other members first got interested in getting more politically active once the city of Regina started looking at banning conversion therapy. For those who don't know, that's a practice aimed at changing someone's sexual orientation, and he felt that was outside of the city's purview. And then he told me something else happened to turn his focus to what was happening in education.
I was meeting with a client for lunch one day, and he mentioned how his 5-year-old son came home and asked if he was really a boy because his teacher said he might be a girl. And then again, teacher out of her lane. And so I got together with two other fellas, the three of us, and we just said, what can we do with this? And so we decided to start an organization, just made people aware of what was going on.
So just so we're clear, none of us can know what that child's teacher said to him or how that child interpreted it before relaying that conversation to his father. But it was this incident that alarmed Bernikavich about how gender and sexual identity was being discussed in classrooms.
So what does he say the group's goals are?
Well, number one for him is that the city should deal with civic issues and schools should deal with what he says is the core issues of education. And he sees things like talking about gender or sexual identity or sex education as perhaps straying out of the school board or city council responsibilities and crossing into what he calls the family lane. And one of the other things he mentioned is testing in subjects like reading, writing, and mathematics show Canadians across the board, but in Saskatchewan as well, the students are falling behind, and teachers should stick to teaching those subjects. Now, RCAN's been active for a few years and working to exert influence on school board policies to that effect. And I saw that for myself back in 2023. I heard that some RCAN members were going to attend a Regina Public School Board meeting in June of that year to protest against gender ideology. So I went to go check out the school board meeting, and I was surprised to see so many people gathered there for what seemed like a fairly routine meeting, and police there too as a precautionary measure. And there was clearly some tension between some of the educators who were there and the allies of the LGBTQ plus community and those that were protesting school board policies. And words were exchanged at that meeting. You can have a listen.
Transsexuality is not
what about
sex, bisexuality.
What about it though?
It doesn't need to be taught in the school.
Why are you pushing
It's not taught. It exists.
And so that clip really encapsulates to me, Leisha, the divide here.
Yeah, it sounded pretty tense.
Right? So you have educators and parents who are on one side saying to us LGBTQ plus students, they're in schools. They deserve to be represented and affirmed. As one person heard that tape that somebody says those identities simply exist. And on the other hand, you have parents who say gender and sexual identity don't need to be in schools. Educators should stick to these basics, as they call them, reading, writing, arithmetic. And I think that it's one of these things that everyone cares about children. So I think that that's why two groups so diametrically opposed and they're thinking of what's best for kids, that's why it's getting pretty heated.
Yeah, exactly. So the provincial government already moved this way, though, with the Parents' Bill of Rights, right? So does RCAN, this group that you're describing, do they see this as a victory?
Sure, I did ask Bernakavich that, and for sure, those changes that the government made to the Education Act were what they'd been lobbying for, including having educators inform parents if a child wanted to use a different name or pronoun in class, and educators informing parents if sexual education was going to be taking place. And Bernakavich said the only thing he saw as an issue was that those changes only applied to those under 16, and his group would want to see it applied to all students. And I do want to note at this point that RCAN wasn't the only group that was happy to see the parents talking about this parental rights issue. I did speak to a few religious groups and leaders after the Parental Bill of Rights was introduced, and more than one group, including the Islamic Association of Saskatchewan, expressed support and provided me with a statement of support for that. And that kind of cross-religion, cross-cultural support was something Bernakavich also touched on when he and I spoke.
I just got a pamphlet in the mail today from the STF, and they're encouraging, one of their slogans is, keep education public. And so they're saying it's the public system that matters, and everything should be public. But if you want that, you can't then go putting things into the system that offend people of Muslim faith, people of Sikh faith, people of the Jewish faith, people of the Christian faith. You can't put things in there that are offensive to those people. Otherwise, they're going to form their own schools.
Now, right now, the government's changes to the Education Act are under review and challenge in court, as you know. But one of the big questions is, do parental rights trump the rights of a child? And I went to an RCAN meeting recently where several people were gathered who seemed to feel a pretty strong yes to that question.
So what was that meeting like? Can you give us a sense of what you saw, what you heard?
Yeah, so I went to Living Hope Alliance Church last Tuesday, and there were a crowd of about, 80 other people. And I described most of the audience as skewing older, almost exclusively white. And former teacher Al Fedoric was emceeing the meeting, and he talked about the Canadian Charter of Rights, which starts with the preamble. Whereas Canada is founded upon the principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. So to him, RCAN has that same overarching principle in mind too, the supremacy of God, which he said is then followed by family. And some of the candidates who are running for Regina Public School Board were there as well at that meeting, and they talked about getting support at doorsteps, but also some anger and hate about what people see as transphobia in their platforms. And it was interesting, one candidate described being called a fascist jackal, and another said she was called a religious bigot. And you could tell these were criticisms that had rattled them as they see themselves there to represent the interest of children. And I asked Bernakavich, too, about getting this kind of criticism, and to him as well, it's not new.
And people call us, child haters and so on, and that type of thing. All we want for our kids, if they have an issue, is that they be properly diagnosed. The assumption shouldn't be that you need to affirm them, because if you don't affirm them in kind of what they're thinking, they're going to commit suicide. We need to properly diagnose them, and when they're properly diagnosed, we need to properly treat them. And if you're advocating something different than that, then I think that's child abuse.
I spoke to some educators who were very concerned about RCAN and its candidates' messaging. And one of those educators I spoke to was Regina teacher Brendan Dickey, who says schools have come a long way in accepting and making space for 2S LGBTQ plus students until the introduction of that Parental Bill of Rights.
Like years ago when I was in high school, I probably would have never dreamed of even coming out when I was in the school building. And that's just the nature of growing up in a rural town and being queer, just never really mixed. And it was the 90s, so it wasn't a great time. And I see a lot of kids that were getting more comfortable with being out in their school spaces, whether it's just like with a friend group or if it's a couple trusted adults in the building, whether it's guidance counselors or admin or even teachers. And just feeling safe with being like, hey, I think I might be queer or I might be bisexual or gay, and being okay with that and having somebody say, that's great. Like, how can I support you? And since last year, now it's been almost like a backpedal where I'm seeing less kids that are trying on identities and trying on different pronouns to find what sort of fits them. And it's making it hard to create any sort of authentic connections with kids because they're worried about whether they're going to be punished for being a certain thing or not.
So that's Regina teacher Brendan Dickey. And Jenny, Brendan was in your story. You wrote a story about this group and shared some of the reaction that Brendan had. So once that story was published, what have people had to say about what you've written?
Of course, there are people, and there were people who agreed with RCAN's position. They were responding on Twitter, or the platform formerly known as Twitter, to say educators need to stay out of issues of sexual orientation, while others I saw were dismissing RCAN members as religious nut jobs. It's a direct quote. But there were other people who felt we shouldn't be giving this group any attention. They described this as an attempt at balanced journalism and described this as a hate group that doesn't deserve publicity of any kind, good or bad. That said, it is a group with organizing and endorsing 7 candidates: Kelly Bond, Carla Taylor-Brown, Tracy Sparrowhawk, Doug Armbruster, Lee Harding, and Mandeep Sinhar. So if people are looking at a ballot and they want to vote on one side of an issue or another, I think that's information they may want to have, and it's our job to give voters that information. And after all, it's the public that will be deciding what kind of public school system they want to have and who they want to have representing that.
That's why we get. That's why we get to vote.
Absolutely.
Right? What day did they say? November 13th. There's a lot of election action happening right now, but on that one, we're voting November 13th, right?
I think so. Yes,
think
Jay's nodding.
13th.
Yes,
it is the 13th. The provincial one is October 28th.
Thanks, Leisha,
Jenny,
for reminding me.
Yeah, I really appreciate your work on this, though. It's been really great hearing these different perspectives on it. So thank you.
Thanks, Leisha, for having this discussion.
That is the CBC's Jenny Whitfield. Now, in a moment, we're going to hear from a national reporter who has looked at how this is playing out, not just in Canada, but in the United States. And so we'll take a broader look at the issues and how people with these points of views are infiltrating local politics and how that plays out. So that's coming up in a moment. But first, I want to share an email that we got from Kevin, who writes, "This entire discussion is a bit ridiculous when you consider the irony that these candidates and their supporters have indoctrinated themselves into believing that schools are indoctrinating their children. Teaching kids that it's okay to be different isn't indoctrination, and teachers are not secretly whisking children away to have sex change surgeries without parents' knowledge." That's from Kevin. You can email us to bluesky@cbc.ca. You can also call us. We'll be opening the phone lines in about 10-15 minutes, so you can write this number down, 1-800-716-2221. And we'll be joined by Jay Skelton, who is an assistant professor of queer studies and education at the University of Regina. And Jay is ready to have some dialogue on this. And so if you have questions and you want to talk, 1-800-716-2221. Again, we'll be opening the phone lines in about 10-15 minutes. I'm Leisha Grabinski. You are listening to Blue Sky here on CBC Radio 1, 94.1 FM in Saskatoon, 102.5 FM in Regina, 540 on the AM dial right across Saskatchewan. So this movement that you've just been hearing about from the CBC's Jenny Whitfield, it's been happening at the school board level in Regina, but it's also being played out across the country. And it's something that caught the attention of CBC investigative reporter Jonathan Montpetit. A documentary looking inside the fundamentalist Christian movement that wants to remake Canadian politics aired last summer on the CBC podcast Front Burner. So Jonathan has been listening into this show so far, and he joins us right now. Jonathan, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hi, Leisha. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so when I was listening to Jenny, when she was just starting to work on this story, I said, this sounds like a lot like a documentary I listened to a few months ago. So I'm so glad that we can have you as part of this conversation. And you heard Jenny, you heard the reporting that she's done. How does what's happening at the school board level here in Saskatchewan compare to what you were seeing in Ontario?
Well, it's very familiar. It's very similar. So back in 2022, I was looking into the school board elections in Ontario, and we noticed that there were a large number of candidates for school trustee positions who were running on very similar platforms, and these were candidates across the province. And so that in itself struck us as kind of unusual, and we dug a little deeper, and we found that a lot of these platforms, candidates were running on so-called anti-woke positions, which kind of meant that they were opposed to things like the teaching of critical race theory in schools, and especially that they were opposed to policies that were aimed at making schools more inclusive of gender and sexual minorities. So this included like opposition to pronoun policies, or opposition to certain books being in school libraries, the content of sex education courses. And around the same time, there were school trustee elections in British Columbia, and we saw also that there were similar slates of candidates running there. What we noticed about a lot of these candidates is that they were affiliated with churches, or invoked religious reasons for their policy positions. We noticed that religious groups like the Campaign Life Coalition and another group called Liberty Coalition Canada, they were helping recruit and train candidates to run in these elections. The Regina Civic Awareness Action Network has also been pretty open about its Christian beliefs and motivations. And so I think what we're seeing across the country is an increased willingness of conservative Christian lobby groups to get involved in politics, and particularly to get involved in politics at the local or school board level.
Yeah. When did this all start happening? Because I think it was pretty common to think of school board elections as being pretty sleepy, right? Like fairly low voter turnout, maybe not super spicy or a lot going on. So when did we start to see this shift?
So I think sex education has kind of always been a hot button topic for conservatives. There was a lot of conservative opposition to sex education reforms in Ontario back in 2015. In 2018, when British Columbia made changes to its sex education policy, there was also opposition from conservative Christian lobby groups. But I would say that, like, since the pandemic, school board elections in Canada and in the US have become like very, very charged. Just school board politics in general have become very charged. Like the scenes that Janani described, like, that kind of stuff is happening across the country. And I think, there's a sense that schools are kind of on the front line of the so-called culture wars. I think, before, school board elections tended to be about, budgets and busings and those kind of important but very localized issues. And I think now there's a sense that, at least among conservatives, that school boards can be a vector for implementing very significant social change. And so school board elections, generally the turnout is low, but the consequences can be high. And so with a little bit of organizing, you can really bring about quite significant policy shifts. And I think conservative groups in Canada have learned from that trend in the US. And now we're seeing more serious organizing happening in things like these school trustee elections.
Yeah, and as soon as you mentioned the pandemic, a lot of thoughts come to mind, right? Like I just think about that time, and it's come up a few times lately on the show as we've talked about education, like thinking about the mask mandate and how that had to play out in schools. And even thinking back, how important the Black Lives Matter movement was to people, and how that ended up being a conversation that was intertwined with lots of things, right? And so what kind of organizing have you seen that made these issues front and center, and for a lot of the church groups that are connected to some of these candidates? Like, just talk a little bit about the organizing that you've seen.
So the organizing is quite interesting. So I think to go back to the pandemic, which was 50 years ago.
Sure.
It does seem a long time ago, but I think it's easy to forget how unsettling a lot of those public health measures were. They were so unusual for us, and I think for churches, when they were forced to close because of these public health measures, it was really disruptive for their sense of their community. And so, one of the reactions we saw, some, by and large, churches complied with the public health measures, but there were some churches in Alberta, BC, Ontario, a few small ones in Quebec, where pastors disobeyed the public health measures because they felt so strongly that the state shouldn't have the ability to close down their ability to have a community gathering to kind of establish their communion with God. They felt it was a gross violation of their charter rights. And so out of that, there emerged a particular movement of churches who kind of stated their opposition to not just the public health measures, but any kind of sense of government overreach into affairs that they felt should be theirs alone. And there were about 300 churches in Canada signed something called the Niagara Declaration, which was kind of an effort to articulate this kind of a manifesto of sorts, calling for church autonomy from the state. And out of that emerged this particular group called Liberty Coalition Canada, that really kind of took the forefront in organizing campaign training for candidates in the Ontario school board elections, and even reached out to a Republican think tank from the U.S. who they kind of organized a training seminar for a lot of these local aspiring politicians. And so kind of, I think, gives you a sense of how at least one facet of the religious right in Canada has kind of sought to engage in politics in a way which I think has been relatively unusual for, at least Canadian conservatives and Canadian Christian groups who have tended to kind of take a more backseat role or kind of distance themselves from a lot of over political organizing.
So obviously this intrigued you because, as you noticed, church is becoming increasingly political. You spent some time listening to sermons, some different podcasts. What did that tell you?
Well, I think one, it told me. I think I was struck by how by the rhetoric I was hearing. This was quite overtly political, very partisan, very discriminatory in some respects towards trans people, towards other racialized minorities in society. And again, we don't want to kind of paint a picture that this is a majority of churches, but by no means is it kind of a small but vocal minority. But it did kind of open my eyes to the kind of rhetoric that is being used in the pulpit a lot of these places. I think also that a lot of these churches have very active memberships, very active communities. So I'm from Quebec, and you go into a Catholic church here on Sunday, and it's hard to find anybody there. But in a lot of these churches on Sunday, they're jam packed, and there's a band playing. And I think also what's interesting, a lot of these churches, and I think to get back to the school issue, is a lot of these churches are also either run their own private school or deploy resources to help parents do homeschooling for their children. And so there's a big sense, I think, in a lot of these churches that society at large is kind of in a state of decay, that the education system can't be trusted, that the education system is pushing values that are antithetical to their beliefs. And so they're kind of establishing alternatives to ensure that their values are communicated to children within their community.
Right. Interesting. I remember the documentary. You had slipped a recording device into your pocket when you attended an event. Do you want to tell us about that? And we can play some of the documentary.
Yeah. So the Liberty Coalition Canada and some other religious organizations, they organized a conference in southwestern Ontario, and I really wanted to attend this conference. And I tried to attend a previous conference of theirs, but they wouldn't allow me. So this time around, I just bought a ticket online like anybody else, and flipped on my recording device on my iPhone, slipped it in my pocket, and kind of walked around, and just kind of wanted to hear people, see what kind of people were there. And if you kind of roll the clip, you'll be able to kind of get a sense of the vibe at this particular conference.
Okay, let's listen.
You got a ticket to show me on your phone?
Yeah.
Okay, good to go. So there's 2 tables at the side, and you can fill out a name tag.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Harvest Bible is a large, thriving church. It's in a newly renovated building. Inside, there's a cafe, a small gift shop, a gymnasium. It even runs a private Christian school. I take a seat in the cavernous chapel, which has space for 2,000 people and a state-of-the-art sound system. The conference starts with a couple of songs by the church's house band. first speaker talks about how global warming is being exaggerated in order to control us. During a break, I walk around the exhibitors hall, where a handful of sponsors have set up booths.
Take some coffee, take some stickers, take a pen, please. This is all free. Our sponsors have been tremendously generous with us.
That's Andrew DiBartolo. He's part of a church in Kingston and co-hosts a podcast called The Liberty Dispatch, where he rails against, well, a lot.
And this is The Liberty Dispatch. Confirm the narrative with the propaganda arm of the Canadian government. Now, they're the CBC. Vaccines. If you want them, Canada is the place to get them. The firing squad covers the experimental gene therapy.
I see he's giving away coffee beans at his table, and the label catches my eye.
And the name of the coffee is Defund the CBC.
That's one of their roasts. So this is their light roast. Liberal Tears is their medium roast. Empty Promises is their decaf. It's very good for decaf. Very, very good for decaf.
At another booth nearby, a young man in a suit is sitting behind a table. The stall belongs to Liberty Coalition Canada, the Christian advocacy group I mentioned earlier. I notice on the title page of their booklet is written, "Please keep classified," all in caps, highlighted in red. So I asked the guy behind the table.
What are these?
So this is, he wrote this book.
He points to a man standing nearby.
Plan to help Christians infiltrate the political system.
Maybe you didn't catch that. My recorder was in my pocket. But if you listen carefully, you can hear him say it's a plan to help Christians infiltrate the political system.
Get them in municipal, provincial, and federal governments.
And can we take one of these?
Yeah.
Oh, it's amazing. Thank you.
Back at my hotel, I flipped through the 40-page plan. The document claims Liberty Coalition Canada helped over 100 candidates to run in municipal and school board elections across Canada last year, including dozens in Ontario. The language is folksy. There is talk of good guys and bad guys. It uses clip art of cartoon characters like Bugs Bunny and Eeyore to make its point. But the document is also quite extreme. At one point it reads, "The perverts are organizing politically and they are getting the evil laws they want." It reveals the group's bigger ambitions, trying to raise $1.3 million to recruit and train hundreds of Christian politicians at all levels of government. The document says the ultimate goal is, quote, "the most powerful political disruption in Canadian history." This appears to be a secret plan to turn Canada into something like a theocracy. Is this for real, or just the hopes of a lone radical Christian?
Such an interesting documentary. That is the CBC's Jonathan Montpetit, who is also our guest today on Blue Sky. I highly recommend people listen to that documentary. It first aired on Front Burner. And Jonathan, I know that in addition to attending that meeting, you also talked to people who are members of the LGBTQ community, and you've heard from people who say they feel less safe now, which is something I've heard on this show. We know that people in Saskatchewan have talked about how they feel less safe now. We're going to hear in a moment from someone who teaches queer studies in education at the University of Regina. And so we'll hear more about how the backlash to LGBTQ people and their rights, how that's affecting queer people in Saskatchewan. So we will get to that. But I want to ask you just one last question before we let you go. How would you say the social conservative movement that we've been hearing about here in Canada has evolved since your documentary first aired?
So I think, when I started researching the Ontario school board elections back in 2022, and then did the documentary you just heard, there were a lot of interest in the kind of anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ policies that were being passed in the U.S., but there are not yet in Canada any of those policies in place. Fast forward to today, New Brunswick has in place a pronoun policy. Saskatchewan, of course, has in place this pronoun policy, parental bill of rights. Alberta is likely to pass a number of policies in the coming weeks. We'll see what happens in the election in British Columbia. So I think in a very short period of time, we've seen a very significant shift in the kind of policy landscape when it comes to this issue, and more conservative politicians being willing to implement these policies. And I think like one way to kind of think about the shift is, I think, for a long time, the conventional wisdom, if you were a conservative politician, was to stick to fiscal issues and downplay social conservatism, and that was not going to be a winner at the ballot box. And I think we have to ask ourselves now, has that changed? And I think the school board elections in Regina, the provincial elections in Saskatchewan, I think will provide some answers to what extent that landscape has changed and whether it aligns with what voters feel comfortable with.
Yeah, because we're in a democracy, so people will get to vote very, very soon in a number of elections. It's a busy time. So, Jonathan Monpetit, thank you so much for being part of the show today. Appreciate it.
For having me on. Thank you.
That is Jonathan Monpetit, a CBC investigative journalist. You can see his reporting on the CBC website. So you may have questions on what you've been hearing so far. We're ready to take your calls, 1-800-716-2221, or you can email bluesky@cbc.ca. But I know that our next guest has a lot to say. Jay Skelton is an assistant professor of queer studies and education at the University of Regina. Jay's been listening into the show and joins us right now. Jay, hello.
Hello and good afternoon.
Yes, I'm sure you are just dying to jump in here. What initial thoughts do you want to share after listening to everything you've heard so far on the show?
I have been taking a lot of notes through the show, and I wanted to start out by saying, like, Jeremy Cockrell and I share some values. We share that school board elections are important, that these really matter, and they fundamentally impact students and communities across Saskatchewan. I want us to really think about the language of parental rights and to be aware that parental rights really is coded language because it is more saleable than saying fundamentalist Christian values in public schools. And I think if we had on signs that said fundamentalist Christian values in public schools, people would feel much more circumspect. Many people would. I also want us to be cautious of thinking about Christians or people of faith as a monolith. And so to say that Christians feel a particular way simply isn't accurate. And I say this knowing churches and church communities across Saskatchewan that are welcoming of 2S LGBTQIA plus people, who are affirming, who want to see 2S LGBTQIA plus people safe and welcome and able to thrive in their communities. So I feel a criticism there. I want to point out that you've been saying we get to vote. The people who are most impacted by this legislation don't get to vote.
Very good point.
So
yeah,
children in schools don't get to vote. This is applied to them, and they literally have no official route to comment on that or to impact what's happening. Absolutely, what I'm hearing from teachers and from students is that this is making schools less safe. It's making schools less welcoming of 2S LGBTQIA plus people. It's making it harder to run gay-straight alliances and other groups that would affirm students' identities. It's meaning that students who might want to start at school with a name or a pronoun that is different from what is on their initial ID before they go home to the most important people in their lives and tell their families, don't feel like they can do that, and they feel like they don't get to set their own timeline. And it means that children, and I want us to think of children as an equity-seeking group who actually experience oppression in our society, don't get to control some of the fundamental aspects of their own personhood.
I want to ask you just one question before we go to some callers, because we did promise that we would open the phone lines. But, getting back to some of the initial things that were stated on the show, even just thinking back to that meeting, the SARM meeting, and people's plea for getting back to the basics when it comes to education, reading, writing, arithmetic, and some of the concerns raised are whether or not sexual education has a place in the classroom. So I'm just curious, if you can just kind of broadly touch on what your perspective is, what should be taught in the classroom.
So I want us to think about schools as places that are preparing people to be active members of our society. We know that people receive a variety of information at home. We know that people can be exposed to new information at school and integrate that and still hold on to values from their home communities. We need a wide variety of subjects at school. We also know that students find it very hard to learn if they don't feel safe and welcome. So no matter who you are, if you feel like your school doesn't have room for you, it's very hard to focus on any of the learning. I'm also going to say that we've seen cuts to Indigenous education, to arts education, to music in schools, to supports for students with disabilities. And so when we say focus on fundamentals, we're saying that all of those things are unnecessary. And that's really harmful. And it's harmful to some of the more vulnerable students in our systems. I think that often we talk about the fundamentals, the math and the English, because they're testable, because we can measure them. And when we only focus on the things we can measure, we miss a lot. And I'm going back to Jeremy Cockrell talking about teachers who believed in children, who kept them feel safe, who had them feeling welcome in classrooms. Those aren't things we're measuring on those tests, but we know that they are essential for learning.
Even the argument that we heard, keep the politics out of the classroom, right? I think someone said teachers are creating little socialists, and I'm wondering, like, what is political? I think that's the question that I have, and fair if you agree with the politics of the teacher. Maybe it's not an issue, but then when you don't, it becomes an issue. But are we talking like climate change? Like, there's some topics. Like, what makes it political? Do you know what I'm getting at? It's a curious question that I have, actually, as a journalist and as a parent.
I mean, I think, again, we're hearing really loaded language. I don't think there is an unpolitical topic that is safe to teach in schools. Even if we're teaching reading, what are the texts that people are reading? Why have we decided that this is an essential skill? What else isn't happening at the same time? I noticed that social studies is left off that list. Social studies is the class that helps us think about how did we get here? What have been social movements? How does change happen in our society? Why are communities important? Those are pretty essential to being actively engaged in your community and in a political life. We need those subjects as well. And so what I want to say is any choice in education is a political choice. That said, we have a curriculum that's set at a provincial level. We have divisions, so school divisions, that are then talking about how to implement those curriculums and making decisions about what books and resources come into schools. Teachers have scope as professionals in how they're delivering education, but they're doing that within a framework from the province of curriculum and from the division in terms of policy and guidelines. So while a teacher shouldn't be sharing their personal political views with their class, they are empowering students to think about themselves as active agents in society.
So interesting. Okay, I want to get to a couple of callers if we can here. Enough questions from me. Let's go to Janaea, who joins us right now in La Ronge. Hi, Janaea.
Hi. I want to identify very quickly as a transgender woman, and I want to mention that for myself, I'm sick and tired of listening to fundamentalist evangelical people. I've experienced their wrath for all of my life, and I have no desire to hear any more of it. So I don't want to be in conversation with them because it's never a conversation. It's always I will tell you how to think, believe, act, whatever, and you can shut up. So I have no interest in those fundamentalist evangelicals who function in that kind of way. With respect to Bill 137 and what's going on in our schools at the present point in time, I'm tired of listening also to that bullhorn, foghorn kind of crap coming from that sector of our society, from the politicians who are beholden to that sector of our society. I don't want to hear any more of it because I want people to be able to simply live their lives, not be told how to live, directed how to live, and so on and so forth. When we had a rally recently in Saskatchewan around the whole issue of Bill 137 and rights for transgender people, I did not appreciate having a member from that community sit there with a foghorn, bullhorn for 3 or 4 hours, calling us pedophiles, child molesters, and on and on and on. How would she liked if I had brought my megaphone, turned it on her for 3 or 4 hours, and called her idiot for that period of time, or whatever I decided to call her? So, for one, we are so far behind in this province and so far behind in this country in terms of rights for LGBTQ people that it isn't funny. And we need to keep working and get working. And if people are opposed to it, take a look at some of the other realities that we've been opposed to in Canadian society over a long period of time. And we don't always come out smelling like roses with that reality. We don't come up smelling like roses with respect to German people during the First World War being interned, with Japanese people during the Second World War being interned, and a whole bunch of other groups of people who have been oppressed, including the gay community. So that's about all I have to say.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that you picked up the phone and called. Thanks for joining the conversation today.
Thanks.
Jay, I'll let you, we might have room for one more caller, but I'll just let you, if you want to respond a little bit to that.
I think that really is sort of the crux of the conversation we're having. This is about, do queer, trans, gay, bisexual, asexual people get to live out our lives and feel safe in schools? You know, in the earlier conversation coming from Arcan, there was a comment about properly diagnosed. And I want to say that that is language that is unacceptable to the medical community. You know, our sexual orientation, our gender identity is part of human diversity. It's part of who we are. And every recognized medical association says that affirming care is the appropriate kind of care to be giving people. And so when we have religious fundamentalists putting forward outdated, harmful, and damaging ideas as if they are equal to what is accepted and recognized and helpful, we're doing harm to individuals and communities.
Just one last question, because we're almost out of time. These shows fly by. But Jay, people will vote who are over the age of 18. And I'm glad that you pointed it out, that we're talking about kids and they can't vote. But for those who are over the age of 18 who will vote, and whoever ends up getting a position on the school board, what kind of change might we see? You know, what kind of impact could an individual have as a school board trustee?
School boards are setting policy for their schools. In the last year, since Bill 137 was enacted, I've heard from teachers who've been told not to run GSAs, who've been told not to do pride events. I think about the impact of not having third parties deliver health and human development content. And I want to say I'm saying health and human development because we hear the word sex ed and we think a particular thing. But I think about an elementary teacher telling me that she wanted to have public health come in and teach hand washing, but that's a third party teaching health and human development, and so she wasn't able to have an expert come in and talk about the value of hand washing. So when we say we can't have third parties in, that's some of the things that we're losing. We're losing content about sexual violence, we're losing content about gender-based violence and discrimination, and about how people can access services that support survivors and prevent intimate partner violence. These are things we absolutely need here. And these are decisions that can be impacted at the division level. So school board trustees can impact those kinds of things, and we need to make choices that are more in the interests of the health and well-being of students.
Okay, we're going to have to talk again, Jay. Thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
That is Jay Skelton, Assistant Professor of Queer Studies in Education at the University of Regina. I'm sorry to those we didn't get on the radio today, but you can call our talk back and we can share that with folks too in that way. 1-800-661-7540. I'm Leisha Gravinsky. You've been listening to Blue Sky. As you know, the provincial election kicked off officially today, and we are going to talk about that tomorrow on this show. So join us back here between 12 and 1 right here on CBC Radio 1.